Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Forum. My name is Patrick Thompson. I'm a former board chair of Grace Cathedral. I'm on the board of trustees of the American Conservatory Theater, and maybe because I'm theatrical as a lawyer, they asked me to be Jake's interlocutor today. Every year, the cathedral chooses a theme. And this year's theme is the year of the body. And the body, we ask lots of questions about the physical self, but there are also these kind of existential questions about who are we, what are we about, who do we want to be, and who do we envision ourselves to be? And so we're delighted this morning to have Jake Heggie with us, who has explored this idea as Heggie.
Right. It's okay.
See?
We had this conversation. And I'm already interrupting you, lawyer.
Well, someone who does and is acclaimed at doing contemporary operas, dealing with subjects with complex characters in search of identity and finding redemption, which is a great thing in the season of Easter that we have at Grace Cathedral. And works that he's done have included Dead Man Walking, It's a Wonderful Life. He sat on this stage with a predecessor dean to discuss Moby-Dick, which he re-envisioned in an elaborate and interesting way. And in this one is based on a French novel, which is a classic French novel from 1947 called Si j'étais vous, so if I were you.
Right.
And so please join me in welcoming Jake. So in the Episcopal Church, we do things in threes, and we often ask like three tough questions. And so but because I don't want you to just kind of speak, I'm going to tee up some of these questions. But really, one of the questions that I have to start is why opera? Why is that your chosen medium?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you so much. And thank you all for coming so early on a Sunday morning. I appreciate it, and it's great to talk to you. And how amazing that the theme of this opera fits so well into this theme with Grace Cathedral, the Year of the Body. But opera, it's a good question. I think it found me rather than me finding it. I grew up loving musical theater and songs and great singers, Barbra Streisand, all the great singers of the 60s and 70s, and I knew really nothing about opera. I played the piano and studied classical piano, but I always thought I would grow up to write musicals, because that's what I knew and that's what I loved. And when I moved to France when I was 18, I finished high school in the East Bay and immediately moved to Paris, France, much to my mother's surprise and partial chagrin. And stayed there for 2 years and traveled around and started listening to everything, going to concerts and museums, and sort of started to get that sound of the operatic voice. And I went to the Paris Opera at the Palais Garnier one time on a whim, and heard The Marriage of Figaro, and the Countess was Kiri te Kanawa, and Cherubino was Frederica von Stade. This was like 1979-80, and I had no idea what I was watching. This was before the era of super titles, so I had no idea really what was going on, but I was really taken by the music and the theatricality of it, and the theater, and I think that's probably when it started to roll that way. But then I wound up at UCLA writing for singers, and then I moved from LA to San Francisco and got a job at the San Francisco Opera in the PR marketing department as the writer for the company, and in 1994. And my job was to explore every corner of that opera house and to go to all the rehearsals and get to know people. And so not only was I hearing the greatest singers in the world and watching opera produced from the ground up, but I was getting to know all those people. And they became my friends, and including the people in the Marilla Opera program, young singers just starting out. And they're still some of my closest friends from that first year. So I think, in a roundabout way, I found it found me, and it just infused my spirit. And I realized those are the singers that I want to write for. I love those voices. I love what the trained operatic voice can do, the range of color, expression, how it goes directly to your heart, the magic of being in the room when someone sings like that and unamplified, everything is vibrating, you know. I think that's how it happened. And then out of the blue, I was writing songs for all these singers, and they were doing them all over the world. And out of the blue, Lotfi Mansouri, the general director at the time, said, well, you're writing all these songs for all these great singers. They're doing them all the world. You've won a competition. Have you ever thought about writing an opera? And I said, no.
And so then you did.
Impossible. But then he commissioned me to write my first opera, which was Dead Man Walking. And and that opened the doorway to a career that I could never, ever have imagined. And here we are.
And you started with something so light.
Well, you know, it's funny you say that, because Lotfi's first request was that he said it was for the 2000-2001 season, so for the millennium. So he wanted something celebratory and bubbly, champagne, you know, celebration. And so imagine his surprise when Terrence McNally and I came to him and said, we'd like to do Dead Man Walking. Anyway, but it went very, very, very well. We both really wanted to do a big American drama, and to take on something that was sort of white hot at the core of what's going on in our country and around the world. And the amazing thing about Dead Man was that it feels very much of our time, and yet timeless. People are going to have this discussion and struggle with these issues as long as there are people. And it also felt very American but universal. There have actually been more productions abroad in countries that don't have the death penalty, as well as many productions in this country. This fall, it will have its 70th international production. So I guess we picked the right story.
You did.
Yeah.
So why this story? And maybe you can tell our audience about what this is about.
Well, thank you. If I Were You it's a modern telling of the Faust story, essentially, if you boil it down to basics. And it's the story of a disillusioned young man, a dreamer, a writer, who wishes he could be anyone else because his life doesn't seem to go anywhere. He's unhappy in his own skin. He doesn't feel lovable or likable. And so the devil sees an opening and gives him, in exchange for a bargain, gives him a secret phrase he can sing to someone else and move his entire spirit and identity into their body and live their life for a while. And in this way, if he wanted to, he could move from person to person to person forever and live forever. But what he would do is leave a trail of human wreckage behind him. What we find out as the story moves forward is that he's moving from person to person to be close to this woman that he's always loved, Diana. And she, being the sleuth that she is, starts to put things together and realize this strange series of things is happening. She witnesses one of these transferences, which is horrible, and it follows an accidental killing. And so she's trying to figure out what to do and winds up confronting the devil and finds him in his latest incarnation and essentially says, well, you have to stop this madness. And he says, but I could be anyone. If you could love me, I could be anyone. Who do you need me to be? Who do you want me to be? She says, yourself. So he's faced with this existential question, which I think is very relevant for our time. Are you going to live your life pretending to be someone else, or are you going to die for love as yourself? And I think it's a beautiful story. I think it's a timeless story, and I also think it's very much part of the dialogue right now, where people are losing touch with their identity, and they're told, especially as young people, by advertising, you would be so much happier if you looked like this, or if you acted like this, or if you bought this, or if you had this car, if you wore these clothes, or if you went to this place. It's not really about the individual, it's about the perception of the individual from other people, and that is a big problem. And so to celebrate the individual, you have to celebrate, yourself first, regardless of what other people think of you. And I think that's why I was drawn to the story. It's another identity quest. It has a dark poetry to it that I really liked. And whereas my last opera, It's a Wonderful Life, was all about the angels all around us that we can't see, this one is about the devil that's constantly pushing things forward and tempting you with something else.
Well, and it's about the devil. Who gets to see the devil and who doesn't in the context of this production?
That's a really interesting question, because the way Jean Shear wrote a beautiful, beautiful libretto that is sort of loosely based on the original story by Julian Green. The English translation of that book is not very good. It's kind of leaden.
And it's hard to find.
And it's very hard to find. The original book is gorgeous, but the translation is difficult. And tell me again what the question was, because I got sidetracked.
So how does the devil reveal?
Oh, right. We always know, as the audience, that is the devil. The characters on stage do not. They have because she keeps changing. It's a woman in our version of this Faust story, If I Were You, and she keeps shape-shifting. So because she wants to insert herself into every scene to enjoy watching as people just do what they always do. She even sings an aria at one point that we'll hear where she basically says, you know what, I don't have to do anything. You guys do all my work for me. I just sit back and wait. But the audience is in on the story from that perspective. They always see the devil in whatever guise she's in. Sometimes she's a bartender, an EMT, auto mechanic, a hairdresser named Brittany. But then she also reveals herself as the devil when Diana confronts her. So it's fascinating to see all of that going on while Fabian, the main character, is moving person to person. And at first we know who he is because we watch the transformations. But then in the second act, we don't know who he is. We kind of lose track of him, and it's a surprise. And all of this is exciting to me as a composer because music can let us in on the secret so much better than just words or stage action.
And we're going to help the audience with that because we're going to treat you with some pieces of music. But before we do that, let's set the stage a little bit because the audience has heard about an EMT, about cops, driving. So why don't we just help bring them along a little bit so they understand what the setting is for this?
Okay. So at the very beginning of the opera, and this is Jean's invention, the light, we just hear a heartbeat starting to fade. And suddenly the lights go over, there's an electric shock, and we're in an ambulance. There's a car wreck. There's been a terrible car wreck. Fabian has just been resuscitated with paddles of life. And Britta Mara is an EMT in the ambulance who has just saved his life and says, I'm not going to let you die. You're too special. And that's where it begins with this, and that has overtones of like Frankenstein and Gothic horror, as well as there's overtones of Jekyll and Hyde through this as he changes, bodies. But he's forgotten everything. He doesn't remember what happened because of this accident and being resuscitated. So it goes from there to the auto shop. It's several weeks later, and there's this car wreck, and he's come back not only to try to remember what happened, but also to retrieve his journal, which he left in there because he is a writer. And there he meets Diana, who he's actually met before, but she doesn't remember him, which is part of the problem.
So maybe we can cue to that piece then.
And so this is Diana singing to him. He basically saying, you're pretty lucky to have survived that accident. He says, I feel a lot of things, but lucky isn't one of them. She talks about how she would feel if she'd survived an accident like that. And what's great about this is you can understand why he would be enchanted and fall in love with her based on how she sings and what she sings, which is what we want in an opera. This is from a workshop production last summer at CU Boulder. So these are student singers. And this is Diana and Fabian in a short scene.
You're pretty lucky. I feel a lot of things, but lucky isn't one of them. Really? Because if I walked away from this, if I were still breathing, I'd sing hallelujah. It's not over. Hallelujah. Another day I'm still here. I have my hands, my legs, my eyes. I still have time to learn tomorrow. Don't laugh, I'm gonna learn tomorrow. Yes, I said I'm gonna learn tomorrow. Hallelujah. It's not over.
So she sings Hallelujah. That's a word that becomes associated with Diana in that beautiful, floaty, lyric soprano way that just is so enchanting and gorgeous and makes us want to know more about her. And we can understand why Fabian wants to get closer to her as well. And that word Hallelujah becomes very important through the whole piece.
Why hallelujah?
Well, it was first Jean's idea, but the whole thing about, like you were talking about, the body and the spirit, what does the body mean if the spirit is empty or hollow or gone, you know? And what does hallelujah mean when it's filled with spirit and meaning, and then what does it mean suddenly later when that spirit and that meaning is gone? It's just a word. And yet it's a word associated with this particular moment. So from this point on, anytime there's a transference for Fabian, because what he's doing is trying to get closer to Diana, the character that was Fabian and the one that is becoming Fabian, the word hallelujah is part of that transference. And when in the second act, when there's all these lost souls that Diana finds circling the car wreck, the only word that's left for them is hallelujah. But again, what does that mean at that point? So it's an interesting, and then when does hallelujah suddenly become filled with spirit again? Towards the end of the opera. So it was a brilliant idea of Jean's. And I think he didn't realize it when he found, it's just something that emerged very, very naturally that he gave to Diana, but then it started becoming more and more and more through the piece.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned was this was done at a workshop.
Mm-hmm.
You've chosen to write for young artists. Can you help us learn a little more what the Marilla program is and what it's like to do a work commissioned by the Marilla program for those who aren't familiar?
Well, the Marilla program is a young artist program in the summer, 10 weeks during the summer. How much? 12 weeks, sorry. That's Jean Kellogg who runs the Marilla program. She's my prompter. And it's been going for 62 years, training young artists, young singers, conductors, coach accompanists, directors now. It's an amazing program. And some of the talents that have come through there are my friend Patrick Summers, who's conducted all of my major world premieres in the past, Sylvie McNair, Carol Van Ness, Joyce DiDonato, any number of people you can think of, great, great artists started by going through the Marilla program. And they have traditionally, it's been a training program for young singers and people associated with opera in the business to help them get ready for the professional world, next steps. If you're in Marilla, you might become an Adler Fellow, which is the resident artist program for, young artist program for the San Francisco Opera, and then go on to other things. But what the Marilla program does is it trains them in acting, in singing, diction, performance, all kinds of different things. Well, nowadays, a young singer needs the skill of doing new work, really, to have a career. It is everywhere, and it is part of building a career, not just recreating great works of the past, which is essential and very important, but also being able to create new works for which there's no precedent. So you creating a new work. Anyway, these are very, very talented young singers and people who that I admire and look forward to working with, you know, as their careers progress. Anywhere I go in the world, for one of my productions, there's inevitably someone that was in Marilla in the cast. Just It's a Wonderful Life recently, you couldn't count the Marillini on the stage. It was from leads to chorus to everywhere. It was incredible. So the excitement about writing for young artists, first of all, they're just discovering who they are. Literally, they're discovering their voice, and they're developing it. And that is tremendously interesting to me in terms of identity and claiming your place. And so this story particularly made sense for those young artists. People looking forward to finding their place in the world. Who am I? Am I like Renee Fleming? Am I like Thomas Hampson? You know, who am I like? And then finding your own voice, and this program being part of that discovery and journey. So, and I also, one of the things I love about working with young artists, sometimes more than seasoned professionals, is they are all in and gung-ho and so excited about every single day, every rehearsal, every moment of it. they can't wait to get going. And if you want to try something different or you suggest something different, they go, yes, I want to try that. Yes, let's do that. So the workshop in Colorado was great. These are undergrads who are like all in. And I would say, well, let's try cutting from here to here. And they're like, that is great. Let's do that. And then like, well, let's try it back. Yes, let's, and that's the kind of energy that allows you to be creative and to explore. Whereas if you're in a group of people who are like, oh, I've already learned it. Why are you cutting it? I mean, I'm going to have to go home and like work on this. It's like, really? I'm so sorry to disturb you. But we are creating a new piece. I don't find that very often.
That never happens.
No, it never happens. But what's great, that I like that youthful enthusiasm and energy, and that's why this piece also felt really cool for them. Also, the whole, thing about there is this main character, Fabian, who is in the first 20, 25 minutes of the piece and then disappears until the end, except that he actually is there. All these singers in the Marilla program become that lead character at one point. 6 different people become Fabian at some point, which is a fascinating journey and a big acting challenge as well, because it's not just enough just to be a great singer anymore. You have to be a great singing actor. And so to be able to be the character that you're assigned, and then when this other character infuses you, find the resonance of that character and their music while you still have the physical identity of the previous character is a huge, interesting challenge.
So let's bring this back to If I Were You. These characters, Fabian, Diana, they're around college age, post-college characters.
In their 20s.
What can you share about the exploration of perspective of that age versus what we see in the context of broader knowledge? Because if we look out, we don't see a lot of college-age students here, but there's an interesting play that you do where we look at what it means to grapple with identity when you're younger versus how you wrestle with the same questions when you have the benefit of age and perspective.
Right. Well, and that's something that the audience can bring. The goal in opera and theater, I think, is not necessarily to make the audience feel for the characters, but to make them feel with the characters. And for a lot of people who are seeing this, they're either experiencing things like this for the first time, these kinds of questions, or they have experienced them before. And the thing is, identity questions we struggle with all our lives, wondering how to deal with the hand we're dealt. But in terms of perspective within the story, the devil gives us all the perspective we need, no matter what character, because, of course, she, Britta Mara is her name, has the perspective of the whole history of the human race and how things repeat, how people make the same journeys. And so her perspective as the kind of wise, even though not benevolent, person on the stage helps give perspective, I think, for the audience and also for the characters on the stage.
So let's tee up the next track.
Yes.
Which is Britta Mara.
Yes, this is Britta Mara. This is the end of a scene that took place in a bar. Fabian has now done 2 transferences. He's now a young, handsome, kind of brute named Paul, and he and Diana have just run off to have an adventure. And Britta Mara, who's been the bartender through the whole scene, steps forward by herself with this glass that has a cube of ice in it that's melting, 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 that she's going to drink down. And she basically is reflecting on, I don't have to do a thing. I just watch and wait, and soon every trace is gone. It's frankly a really cool aria. That was a good day when I wrote that song. We refer to it as the Ice Cube Aria. It might be a little difficult to get all the words, but the basic sense is, I take a cube of ice, rigid, cold, perfectly formed, a hard little fortress. Shall I breathe on it, hold it in my hands? No, I don't actually have to do a thing. I just watch and wait. And it turns into kind of an opera torch song, which is very cool. Anyway.
Okay.
I I take a cube of ice, rigid, cold, perfectly formed, a hard little fortress. Shall I breathe on it, hold it in my hands? No, 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 I don't have to do a thing. I just watch and wait. Everything wants to change, to melt, dissolve, disappear. Soon, 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 I will drink it down, 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 and no one will ever know, no, 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 know that it ever existed at all. I don't have to do a thing. I don't have to do a thing. Not a thing, 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 not a thing. I just watch and wait. Soon every trace is
That cool? I want Adele to sing that, right? Katie Lang.
Wow. So, how is it that this devil character develops in the work and manifests her tentacles?
Right. Well, the thing is, the devil doesn't have to really develop. She's consistent throughout. That's the thing about the devil. It's consistent. It's surprising because of the shape or the form or how she inserts herself or how she comments. But still, that's her personality right there alone. Just going, you know what, I don't really have to do anything. Well, I mean, what does the devil have to lose, you know? She made a bargain for this soul. If she doesn't get this one, she'll get another one, you know? That's the point of her aria, which is kind of sad and bleak. And yet, in all of that, we have to find this human journey where this remarkable person, Diana, suddenly emerges and is willing to take that on. You know, and in the excerpt, if we listen to the whole thing, the whole next excerpt, Diana even says to the devil, I will bring him back. And the devil says, you can't. And Diana looks at her and says, we'll see. And then walks off, which is pretty bold.
Well, let's
Yeah.
share a little bit more about who Fabian becomes in this journey and the types of characters he inhabits and whether those are archetypes.
It's interesting that you mention archetypes. I like archetypes because they help an audience identify the general place where a person fits, but then we can go deeper and they can become more than archetype because every one of us is complicated. But first he infuses himself into his boss, who he hates. His boss is pompous and mean and dismissive, but he's rich. And he boasts about having this fabulous life, all these travels, all these adventures. And yet, once Fabian gets into there, he realizes he was lying about the adventures, he was lying about this. And one of the lines that Jean has put into each transference after it happens is, I thought it would be different. And isn't that the experience of like imagining the grass being greener and imagining living someone else, not appreciating what you have? But then he becomes Paul, the physically handsome, virile guy who turns out to be a drug dealer and really not a good guy and not a nice guy either. But because Fabian's spirit infuses him, he's able to tone that down somewhat, but still these violent impulses exist within Paul. So then there's an accidental shooting, and then a cop appears, and Fabian realizes he could be the cop just to get out of the room and get out of the situation. So he becomes that, and then we start hearing, and every time there's a transference, there's electric shock. So all of a sudden we start hearing these electric shocks, and we realize at the end of Act 1, we have no idea where Fabian is. And I don't want to spoil it for them, because in Act 2, it's surprising what happens. But he's trying to find people that Diana is intrigued by or attracted to, or that he believes she would be drawn to. And it's not just about getting out of his space or out of that town. It's about finding a way to be close to, in addition to away from who he was. And part of the deal that was made was that there's no going back. In other words, if he goes back, that's when the devil will come collect his soul. So which is why he's avoiding that outcome.
Well, and why don't you speak a little bit more about when he makes those transitions, and he finds himself in those other bodies, the empathy that he starts to feel as he relates to whoever that is that he's assumed.
Well, I mean, that's what the arts are all about, right? Community, empathy, perspective, what it is like to be someone else. I mean, I've never been all those people. I certainly, like in Dead Man Walking, I've never been a convicted killer on death row, or a
Let's
nun,
hope not.
or a nun, and yet, because of my particular talent in composition, I empathize with those people and try to create music and an environment that makes them feel authentic and real and walk in their shoes. And if I can do that, then when a great singing actor performs that role, you can do that too. You as the audience gain perspective on what it's like to walk that walk or be that journey, because it's unfolding in three dimensions in front of you with real people singing their brains out, But that walk of empathy through the piece is part of what drew me to it. There's an Oscar Wilde quote at the end of my email as the tag, which is, "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken," which is a great quote, but it kind of is the overall theme of If I Were You, which I didn't realize when I took it on. It's just, that's kind of something that I feel very strongly. So.
Well, let's tee up the next track then, because we see shadows and we see what it's like after our protagonist has had an opportunity to be a bunch of different people.
Right. So early in Act 2, Diana she overhears a transference, and she grabs the page from his apartment where he wrote down this secret spell and this phrase that he sings every time to transfer his body. And she heard it, and she saw something happen, and now she's on the trail, because she always wanted to be like Indiana Jones, right? So her thing is like she majored in archaeology, much to her regret. But now she's like Indiana Jones. She's on the trail, and she's finding something. And she runs across Fabian, the original Fabian, who's singing just hollow, hallelujah, over and over again. Like he's homeless, he's empty. And she wants to try to awaken something in him, so she takes him back to the auto shop, to the car wreck, to see if that will awaken a memory. And when they get there, what she sees are all these empty souls circling the wreckage, just singing hallelujah. And she starts to recognize Paul and Fabian's boss and these other people that she has seen along the way too, but they can't hear her. They won't respond to her. And all they're doing is singing hallelujah. And so this goes on until she says, maybe you'll hear this. And she sings the prayer, which is a palindrome. And it's based on some Hindu mythology, these words, front and back. And she sings that, and that awakens Britta Mara to appear and challenge her because she's getting a little too close, right? So that's essentially the scene. You're obviously, because of the sound in the room, you're not going to understand every word. But essentially, Diana is trying to get someone to respond to her. And when she sings the spell, that's when the devil actually responds to her. So, and if you, first of all, imagine that it's very, very much louder, and also fully orchestrated, and with a stage with all these lost souls, all these Maryla singers that aren't lead roles, with these big voices, all singing this chorus stuff, and this confrontation on this wrecked car where she's standing up to the, oh, it's so exciting.
And only in a church would you talk about a confrontation with the devil.
I talk about it all the time.
So what is it about this for you? I mean, you talked a little bit about your personal journey and starting in PR, but I mean, this how do you relate to this story?
Well, I think we can all relate to spiritual crises, crises of conscience, wondering why we're on the journey that we are. That's the biggest question of all. Like, why this body? Why this time period? Why me? And I think I've sort of always wondered that. And for years and years, I kind of wandered all over the world trying to find the answer. My birth name is John, after my father, but my nickname was Jake right from the very beginning. And so even at one point, my father committed suicide when I was 10, and that sort of sets you on an unknowable journey of exploration. And when I went away to, when we moved from Ohio, where that happened, to California, I started going by John instead of Jake, because I thought, well, maybe I'll be happier, or I'll find myself as John. Maybe that's who I really am. And then I was that for several years, even though there were always people that called me Jake, or my dear sister, Jill, who always called me Jakey. Jilly. But it was, and then I went on all these other side tracks at UCLA, and I got married to my piano teacher, who was 50 years older than I was, which is an entire other story. And then we moved to San Francisco and started this other life. But it was when I moved to San Francisco that I started living my authentic, true life. I stopped pretending. I stopped being afraid, and I started opening up. And that's when all these amazing things started to happen. When I started writing music, when I started playing the piano again, because I'd lost my ability to play the piano for a while. And then got an opera and found my husband, Kurt, who has a wonderful son who just graduated college, and I just built this family that I could never have imagined because I was pretending to be someone I wasn't and wasn't happy in my own skin. So that journey is very familiar to me. And I think a lot of people go through that kind of journey, trying to settle on who they are and what makes them happy and what is my authentic self. And it's not an easy journey. I think that's part of why I'm drawn to all these different stories. But I also, as an artist, I want to go to stories that are going to challenge and terrify me anew, because I don't just want to repeat myself. So that's why it goes from Dead Man Walking to It's a Wonderful Life and Moby-Dick and 3 Decembers, The End of the Affair, Great Scott, which was a comedy. All of these different pieces are vastly different. I was hungry for a piece like this right now that had this magic realism where we just buy that that's the devil, and it's not, it's sort of like, did you see the movie The Shape of Water? That was such a beautiful, amazing movie, and it's magic realism at its best, because there's like the creature from the Black Lagoon. It's like, but that's just part of the story, And so to bring that element into, I wanted to explore that as well. Yeah.
Well, we're going to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. Sure. And the way we do that at the forum is you can pass your questions to Rebecca. She'll bring them to me. We've got one more track that we want to tee up. But before we get to that, and as Rebecca's collecting some questions, I wanted to ask you about the resonance of this now in an age of social media and the ability to quickly adopt different identity or who you want to be. Can you speak to that?
We're all dealing with that question these days, aren't we? There's a hollowness to it that I think people are waking up to, maybe, that there's this falseness and this hollowness to just living on social media or, constantly sending out images that only represent the very best or ideal world that doesn't represent necessarily the reality, and pretending to be all these different things because for a moment it makes you feel better. and then suddenly realizing you're not connected to other people and you don't have a community, and how important that is. So it feels very current to me and very alive. I was sort of shocked. I do residencies at colleges and universities all over, and I was at, I shouldn't say the name of the university. It's a very, 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 very smart kids. And they were writing their first art song, so they brought me in to talk to them about it. And so I asked these young composers, I said, each individually, so tell me some of your very favorite art songs. And I said, well, then tell me like singers that inspire you. And I thought, you have the entire history of art song and every great singer that's ever sung right here on your device. But you didn't take 1 or 2 hours to just listen and explore. And to me, that is suddenly a lack of curiosity that is coming through having easy access, so that if you get asked the question, yes, I can look it up immediately, but nothing sticks because there's no physical effort involved with it. And I think that physicality of it's why I still write everything by hand, all my scores, every part of it, because I think that physical connection, the work of learning, the work of knowledge is very, very important. So I think it's a very big topic of our time.
And Alan has preached many sermons about that curiosity and the importance of that to our human condition. And let's talk about this last track.
Okay.
And frame that, because Fabian completes his journey. We're not going to give everything away.
Right.
But we'll leave you with this, and then
This is kind of the redemptive thing. This is the final scene, and he decides after all of this, she has offered to sacrifice herself if all the souls can come back. That's where it winds up. And Fabian sees her about to do this, and so he realizes he has to stop her. And so he goes back to his original body, and she goes to find him, and he's dying. She doesn't know he's dying. But this is the scene, the part of the last scene. We'll just play a little bit of it.
Great.
What is it? She opened the door to his apartment. He had returned to his life and the world. Everything was the same, but everything was different. She kissed him and told him, I don't know who you are, but I want to, and I'm not going anywhere until I find out everything. Let us rewrite the world. Let our story begin and end with Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
And then he dies.
In the church, we've just gone through this period of rebirth through death. Tell us about that as it relates to this and the redemption that you find in some of your stories.
Well, I mean, there is, in every one of my operas, there's a sense of redemption, even in the midst of tragedy. Even though Fabian dies, even though the devil is going to come collect his soul, he did do something heroic by saving her. And she was there for him. And so when he died, she was there. So, it's so interesting, that question of redemption and what it means in the midst of tragedy. Even at the end of Bohème, Mimi dies, but there's a great sense of redemption and peace around her death. I don't know. That's a much bigger discussion than for the time we have.
Well, we're not doing the super fire round,
Okay.
but we have lots of questions, and some of them are technical questions.
Okay.
Like, what are the clues that indicate that Fabian has infused or transformed, and how does he go about those changes? Are there different singers? How does it unfold in the actual production?
It's as if, say the theme for Fabian was Frère Jacques, right? And I'm singing Frère Jacques because I'm Fabian, and then all of a sudden, some magical thing happens, and suddenly he's singing Frère Jacques. And then you know, oh my gosh, it's moved over there, especially because this person disappears. So I think it will be interesting musically, dramatically for the actors, and also staging-wise with lighting and things like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting. It's a director's dream, kind of,
So in terms of everyone who comes together to make this possible, can you tell us a little more about the librettist and what it's like to work with different conductors and what that's been like for you?
I work almost exclusively now with Gene Shear on librettos. My first opera was with Terrence McNally, the great American playwright, and I've done 2 big operas with him as well as some other pieces. But Gene and I just have this sort of simpatico thing where he can read my mind, I can read his. It's just a great writing team, and he knows how to challenge me. I know how to challenge him. He knows how to inspire me, and vice versa. So it's a wonderful game of tennis back and forth. He's a great writer. And then and there's a reason people work with the same people when it works well all the time, because that chemistry is hard to recreate. And there are so many unknowns and so many things that are uncertain when you're taking on a big project like this, that the more things that you have that are certain and known, the better,
In the Ice Cube Aria, one person in the audience noted that seemed to reflect or have references to Gershwin. Can you talk about some of your artistic influences and how that drives your work?
It's so interesting with that aria. I've heard people say there's a James Bondy kind of theme to it as well, but which I think is cool. Who knew there would be a Bond girl in my opera, right? And it's the devil.
That's not necessarily inconsistent.
Right? I have so many influences. I'm the sum total of all my influences. And it's not that I sit down and try to write like Gershwin or Sondheim or Bernstein or Debussy or whatever. But those influences are all in there. And so, of course, they're going to pop out every now and then. And maybe you'll hear something that sounds like it was influenced by one of those. But it isn't a conscious choice on my part. It just, when I feel that serves the character and that serves the moment emotionally and musically, that's what comes to me, and I write it down, So it's not definitely trying to model myself after those people, but those are definitely strong influences on me.
So some of your work has been pretty political. And so can you share with us your sense of how this particular opera is political, and whether you have a sense that's optimistic and redemptive?
Well, you don't have to look far to see people selling their souls and shape-shifting, do you? I don't know what I might be thinking about, but I don't, I think great stories like this and really engaging art does have a political element to it because that's all around us now and it is part of our society and our lives. And we have to find human and emotional ways to deal with those things, not just argue about them through talking heads on television or on social media. We need stories. That's the whole point of stories like this, to help us figure those connections out. That's why for as long as there's been opera or singing stories, it's either gods and goddesses, kings or queens, and peasants, common people, So these are just more contemporary ways of telling those stories, but yes.
And if there's one thing that you want this audience to take away from this talk that you may not have shared so far or that you want to amplify, what would that be?
Oh my gosh, I don't want to tell people how to feel or what to walk away with. My whole point in writing is I feel changed by something that moves me or when I see a great performance. So my goal in writing something like this, of this scale, is to make sure that people feel changed or marked in some way or have a new perspective or a new sense of empathy for that kind of person or that kind of person or that walk of life. And to realize that we are all people dealing with these issues. But more than anything, just to feel somehow changed, that you're different from the person that you were when you first walked into the theater, that there's a new perspective or there's a new possibility or a new something going on.
So we'll move from the profound to the quotidien. So how do they get tickets? Where is it being performed? What are some dates?
It's August 1, 3, 4, 6. It's the only opera the Marilla program will be doing. Yeah, there's cards and there's information out on the table. It will be at the Herbst Theater and with a full orchestra of, I think, 31 players. Nicole Paiement, who is the founder of Opera Parallel, will be conducting, wonderful conductor. Katura Stikan-Doucet will be the director. And she's put together a wonderful production with sound design, projections, video, all kinds of things. And and I just finished the orchestra score a couple weeks ago, much to the relief of everyone. But it will be 4 performances, 2 different casts in the performances. So very exciting, though. Yeah.
It sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of the teasers you've given us, the taste of what is to come.
Yeah.
And please join me in thanking Jake Heggie for being our guest tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
And you're not released yet. Final announcements. Next week, Malcolm Young will be back, and he will be here with our new artist in residence, Alonzo King, who is legendary in this area. It's going to be very exciting to go from hearing about the physical body through opera to hearing about it in the context of all the great work that Alonzo does with the Lines Ballet. Of course, you are always welcome to go upstairs after the forum to attend the 11 a.m. Choral Eucharist upstairs. And Grace Cathedral is a house of prayer for all people. It invites the community in to support itself because it is a civic institution and we require your support. So we encourage you to make a contribution to support Grace Cathedral and its programming, because if you like the forum, to make that happen, we ask you to help contribute to make this a continuing legacy of this cathedral as a contribution to our community. And thanks again to Jake for joining us this morning for a fantastic forum.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. That was great.